My mother-in-law suggested that if I could provide her with a grandchild, she would be pleased. It was an interesting proposition, but I found myself thinking, well, actually, I am already expecting. Before I get ahead of myself, let me introduce who I am. My name is Susan, a woman in her 30s embracing the life of a housewife. I share my life with my husband, a dedicated salaried worker. We first met while I was employed at a company related to the food industry. His occasional charming smiles caught my attention during our professional interactions, compelling me to make the first move and ask him out. Initially, he declined politely, explaining that he had a girlfriend. However, about a month later, he approached me with news of their breakup, asking if I was still interested in dating. It seemed my earlier confession had made him view me in a new light, which his then-girlfriend noticed. When she confronted him about his feelings for someone else and he confirmed, she suggested they part ways. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of guilt for inadvertently causing their split, but he reassured me with a gentle smile, insisting that their relationship was nearing its end regardless. His comforting words eased my conscience, and after 2 years of dating, we married. On our wedding day, he expressed his desire for us to start a family and asked if I would support our future children by becoming a housewife. Considering my job at the time was taxing and unrewarding, I agreed without hesitation. Transitioning from a career woman to a full-time housewife proved more challenging and perplexing than I anticipated. Nonetheless, I cherished my new role because life with my husband was fulfilling and joyous. We experienced blissful days without the common troubles of in-law conflicts, which was a significant relief for me. My in-laws lived a mere 12-minute walk from our apartment, and initially I feared their proximity might lead to frequent and possibly unwelcome visits. Fortunately, those fears never materialized. My in-laws were exceptionally understanding and supportive, often stopping by to share helpful tips, and never once complained about our difficulties in starting a family. My mother-in-law often expressed her affection by saying, "I love you more than any grandchild." I've always wanted a daughter, especially since our family is predominantly men. Please let me love you as if you were my daughter. I cherished her words and deeply trusted my father-in-law, who, although a man of few words, proved to be incredibly dependable. This warm and welcoming atmosphere initially defined our relationship during the early years of my marriage. However, as time passed, I noticed a stark change in the demeanor of my in-laws. My father-in-law grew even more reserved, and my mother-in-law's behavior took such a drastic turn that I began to wonder if she had been masking her true personality all along. To illustrate the extent of this change, it felt as though she shifted from overwhelmingly positive to decidedly negative. The once affectionate and understanding woman became increasingly critical and demanding, particularly when my husband was not around. Her visits became more frequent, and during these times she incessantly nagged me about having children soon, insisting that it was not only a desire but my duty as a wife. Previously, she had reassured me by saying children were blessings that should come naturally when the time was right, and there was no need to rush. Yet, now she started comparing us to other families, mentioning how the neighbors had recently welcomed a baby and that another was expecting. This only added to the pressure she placed on me. Despite her insistence, the decision to expand our family wasn't solely up to me. It required my husband's commitment as well. At the beginning of our marriage, he had expressed his desire for children, but aligning our current circumstances with those initial aspirations proved to be a challenge under the growing strain from my mother-in-law. About a year into our marriage, my husband began to show a noticeable lack of interest in starting a family, something he had initially been enthusiastic about. Despite my attempts to reconnect with him, he often dismissed me, claiming he was too tired or more interested in playing video games, responding with phrases like, "Let's do it some other day," or "You're bothering me." When I brought up these concerns to my mother-in-law, hoping for some understanding or support, she seemed unable to empathize. Instead, she intensified her demands for a grandchild, significantly adding to my stress. Overwhelmed by the persistent pressure, I turned to my husband, sharing how difficult the situation had become for me. Reluctantly, he acknowledged that there was no need to rush but agreed to make an effort toward having a child. We both tried, but despite our efforts, I did not become pregnant. Throughout this period, my mother-in-law placed the blame squarely on me, absolving my husband of any responsibility. I began to suspect that the relentless stress she was causing might be impacting my fertility. Unable to cope with the ongoing strain, my husband and I decided to seek fertility treatments. Just as I thought this might relieve some of the pressure, another problem emerged. Since the commencement of the treatments, my husband had grown increasingly distant. He would return from work and seclude himself in his room to play video games, often ignoring my attempts to communicate with him. This aloof behavior could have been manageable, but his attitude worsened significantly when he began to criticize me for spending money on sewing materials, a hobby that brought me some relief on stressful days. His frustration often escalated into anger directed at me. During our arguments, he would quickly lose his temper, accusing me of being financially dependent on him and behaving selfishly, making the atmosphere at home even more tense. This mounting tension only served to deepen the challenges we faced together. When I gently reminded my husband that I had left my job because he had wanted me to become a housewife, he seemed unresponsive and distant. One day, amid our ongoing struggles, I noticed him at home during work hours, absorbed in his video games. Surprised, I asked him if he wasn't going to work. His casual response shook me. I quit. He had resigned from his job without any prior discussion with me. When I probed for a reason, he abruptly told me to stay out of his business and became visibly irritated. Faced with his uncooperative demeanor, I felt compelled to accept the situation. Although I wasn't immediately worried about our financial stability, believing we could temporarily rely on unemployment benefits and our savings, the stress mounted as it became apparent that he had no intention of looking for another job. With his employment gone, he started spending his days at home, rarely venturing out except for occasional visits to the convenience store for cigarettes. His main activity became gaming, filling the hours he used to spend at work. Ironically, the increase in the time we spent together, which might have been a welcome change during the early days of our romance, now felt burdensome rather than beneficial. It did not bring us closer. Instead, it led to more frequent marital disputes. As my husband's behavior started to mirror the negative transformation I had seen in my mother-in-law, our interactions grew increasingly strained, making even simple conversations fraught with tension. Over time, I began to question the viability of our marriage. The joy and partnership that once defined our relationship were fading, leaving behind a growing sense of disillusionment. I started to feel trapped in an unsustainable lifestyle, pondering the limits and the future of our union. Frustrated by the ongoing situation with my husband, who had taken to spending all his time gaming at home, I reached my breaking point. One day, I couldn't hold back my frustration any longer and confronted him. "You're not a child. Stop playing games all day and find a job," I exclaimed. His response caught me off guard. He coolly mentioned that his mother had suggested he divorce me if I couldn't provide a grandchild. Strangely, I felt a sense of relief at his words. Unbeknownst to him, I had discovered earlier that day that I was pregnant. I had planned to share the news with him that evening, but given the current circumstances, I decided it might be wiser to keep this information to myself for the time being. This unexpected revelation from him felt almost like a twisted form of assistance from my mother-in-law, offering me a way out. With a calm I didn't fully feel, I replied, "All right, if that's how it is, here are the divorce papers." I pulled out the documents which I had preemptively prepared from my drawer and handed them to him. My husband was visibly stunned by my swift agreement and readiness with the divorce papers. His usual confident demeanor vanished, replaced by a look of complete surprise. Although he appeared to struggle with what to say next, he seemed resolved to follow his mother's advice, and signed the papers without much resistance. Throughout this, he kept looking at me, trying to read my reactions. After we finalized the divorce papers, we agreed to meet later to discuss the division of assets. However, the reality was that there wasn't much to divide. Known for his spending on hobbies, my husband had invested a considerable amount of money into gaming, even though he often criticized my spending habits on my sewing materials. Saving money had never been his forte. He hadn't saved a penny since before we were married, and this habit hadn't changed after our marriage. As a result, we had accumulated no significant savings or assets to speak of, which made the discussion about dividing our belongings straightforward but somewhat ironic, given the circumstances. I initially thought our discussions about dividing our assets would be straightforward, but my husband had other ideas. He pointed to a specific bank book, insisting, "We still have our savings, right?" Indeed, that account held a significant sum, and he proposed that we split it. However, that particular savings account was not subject to division. It was money I had saved entirely before our marriage, and thus it was not part of our marital assets. Upon hearing this, my husband's face lost color, but he quickly tried to recover, shifting the topic to our living situation. "But surely this condo should be considered for division. I lived here too," he argued. With a calm yet firm expression, I clarified the situation for him. "Unfortunately, the condo is solely in my name, so legally you have no claim to it. Moreover, I've already listed it for sale as it's time for me to find a more suitable living arrangement," I informed him, suggesting he should also look for new accommodations soon to avoid any complications. I had been saving diligently for years, even before my career transitioned to being a housewife, with the goal of eventually upgrading to a larger home, as I anticipated the condo might eventually feel too small. As a working professional, I managed to amass substantial savings and purchased the condo during my single years, thus establishing a strong financial foundation for my future. The proceeds from selling the condo would help fund the construction of a new home in the downtown area. Naturally, these assets were acquired before our marriage, and as such, they were not subject to division, contrary to what my husband might have assumed. Upon realizing he had no claim over the condo or the pre-marriage savings, my husband was visibly shaken. Despite his attempts to extend the conversation, he seemed lost in thought, unable to formulate a response. With nothing substantial left to discuss, our dialogue concluded abruptly, marking the end of not just our conversation, but also our shared financial entanglements. After filing the divorce papers, the separation from my husband was finalized smoothly within a few months. Following the divorce, I moved back to my parents' home, where they provided unwavering support. It was here that I safely delivered a healthy baby boy, whom I named Mark, a name symbolizing strength and ambition. My days became filled with joy as I cherished every moment with my son and my supportive parents. I chose not to inform my ex-husband about the birth. I could only imagine how my former mother-in-law would react if she learned of her grandchild, likely storming in to demand to see him. After the eviction from the condo, my ex-husband moved back with his parents. The swift nature of our divorce seemed to have taken a toll on him. He withdrew from social interactions, rarely left the house, and his neglected appearance even drew the attention of the police on his infrequent outings. Later, I heard that he had quit his job due to strained relationships at work. His demeanor and poor treatment of his female colleagues had ultimately isolated him. It seemed he had abruptly resigned from his job, perhaps revealing his true nature, which he had previously masked, a kindness that was merely a facade. 2 years after the divorce, I found myself managing a craft store. I had become a regular visitor to a local craft shop, and the owner, noticing my frequent visits, offered me the opportunity to take over, as she considered retirement. With my parents' help in caring for Mark, I had the time and energy to re-enter the workforce. Accepting meant keeping the store open, which was important to its many loyal customers. So, I decided to take on the responsibility. While running the store, I was unexpectedly visited by my former mother-in-law and ex-husband. They made casual remarks about how well the shop suited me. My ex-husband, trying to be friendly, even suggested a fabric that would look great on his mother. Annoyed by their transparent flattery, I quickly asked, "So what brings you here?" That's when my former mother-in-law, unable to contain herself, blurted out something that seemed almost comical. "Give me my grandchild back." It turned out she had somehow found out about my son and was now intent on making him the heir to their family estate. This sudden declaration reminded me of the complex dynamics I had left behind, yet here they were, unfolding once again in my new life. When I first mentioned the divorce, my ex-husband confronted me, bewildered. "Why didn't you tell me? I wouldn't have agreed to the divorce if I knew," he accused. "Obviously, I wanted the divorce," I replied sharply. "If you had known I was pregnant, you would have tried everything to stop it." The conversation intensified as my former mother-in-law chimed in with her demands. "So, are you going to give me my grandchild or not? I want to be with him as soon as possible. You've had him for 2 years. Now it's my turn." I was momentarily stunned by her audacity, but was quickly interrupted by the arrival of my parents and my son Mark, who came in looking concerned. "What's going on? Is there a problem?" he asked. It turned out a regular customer had noticed the tension and called them to the shop. As Mark held my parents' hands, my former mother-in-law exclaimed, "Oh, how adorable! He looks just like my son did as a child. Look, I'm your grandma." She moved towards Mark, but before I could step in, Mark firmly said, "I only have one grandma," and clung tightly to my mother. Sensing the rising tension, my mother calmly suggested, "Under the circumstances, it might be best if you leave now." Ignoring her, my ex-husband demanded, "Just hand over the kid," and made a move to snatch Mark from my parents. I stepped in front of him to protect my son, but was easily brushed aside due to my smaller stature. "Mark, be careful!" I cried out, as my ex-husband was just inches away from grabbing him. Then, unexpectedly, a sudden movement caught everyone off guard. Looking up, I saw my father, who had been a police officer and a national judo champion during his youth, execute a flawless over-the-shoulder throw on my ex-husband. Unaware of my father's skilled background, my ex-husband was left on the ground, speechless and in pain, staring up at my father with a mix of astonishment and helplessness. Following the confrontation, my father stood firm and warned, "If you plan on causing any more trouble for my children or grandchild, we may have to involve the authorities. What will it be?" As he spoke, he subtly displayed his police badge, underscoring his seriousness. My former mother-in-law, caught completely off guard by this display of authority, panicked and hastily grabbed my ex-husband's hand before they both fled the scene. Since that day, I have had no contact with either of them, nor do I have any interest in their whereabouts. The whole incident seemed to close that chapter of our lives for good. A few years later, inspired by my father's bravery during that tense moment, my son Mark expressed his aspiration to follow in his grandfather's footsteps. With sparkling eyes and a determined voice, he declared, "When I grow up, I'm going to be a cop too, and I'll protect you." His ambition warmed my heart, and it became clear that he was serious about his goal. Now, Mark dedicates himself to his studies, particularly focusing on areas that will prepare him for a career in law enforcement. Under my father's mentorship, he has also taken up judo, where he's quickly gaining skills and earning recognition among his peers for his prowess. As for me, my role is to continue providing the support and love that Mark needs as he grows. Watching him develop his talents and pursue his dreams with such passion, I feel immense pride and joy in seeing my son embrace such positive aspirations. The challenges we faced have only strengthened our bond, and I look forward to seeing what the future holds for him.